We bring in finally, we got Pete Jensen of NHL Fantasy and NHL.com. Pete, what is happening, buddy?
What's up, Nick? Long time no see. Just recorded an episode of NHL Fantasy on Ice, of course, earlier today. Looking forward to the week ahead in the NHL. Big matchup with Isles and the Leafs. That always brings out the energy in the Islanders, you could say, whether it's this season beating the Leafs earlier in the year or previous seasons. It seems like they still have that grudge with Tavares, so it's always a fun matchup. Good to be with you, man.
Thanks so much for coming on. A lot of spice. You're right. I think that, and I mentioned it, the intriguing thing about this game is like the Islanders are up against it. What's going on with this team? What were the fire Lou chants the other night?
I mean, yeah, it's like what you always say. Time to make a trade. Can anybody make a trade? Can Lou Lamoriello make a trade? Will he make a trade? Based on the past few seasons, it doesn't seem like he's going to make a big splash. They've come close to landing some big fish over the years. Like they were in the running for Panarin, the Rangers got him. They were in the running for Johnny Hockey, the Flyers, the Blue Jackets. The Blue Jackets somehow got him over the Islanders. That's the lay of the land right now. So can they go out there and get a Timo Meier? Do they want to risk mortgaging even more of their future to land a player like that just to try to compete here and now and squeak into the playoffs? I don't think the Islanders are doing much damage, even if they do make it on the back of Ilya Sorokin. Clearly, he's been the bright spot of the team. He's the only chance that they have to make the playoffs at this rate because an early season offensive spark, right, with the hiring of Lane Lambert to replace Barry Trotz, that's tapered off significantly. This is once again a bottom 10 offense in the league, a bottom 5 power play. So that's the answer to your question. They need a sniper. They need a Timo Meier, a Patrick Kane, a Vladimir Tarasenko to get out of this mess right now. So that's where they stand.
Yeah, I'm curious to see the urgency from this Islanders team tonight because, again, that's the big story for me. It's not so much about John Tavares anymore. It's about the urgency, coming out of the Islanders. The fact that they come into this game 3 points out of a playoff spot. They beat the Maple Leafs back in November, on November 21st, a 3-2 overtime win in that game. And they really, really need the 2 points. Ilya Sorokin, by the way, will start this game against Ilya Samsonov. So an all-Russian battle there. So John Tavares, I can't believe it, Pete, but the 10th outing for JT against the New York Islanders. Can you believe it's been 5 years, and do people still hate this guy as much as they did when he left?
A lot of them probably do. A lot of people are bitter, right, for different reasons, and they target a player like that. But I do think it's going to be a great matchup. They've played each other competitively. The Islanders have, as much as the Leafs have Tavares and have been a successful regular season team, they haven't done much either. The Islanders have actually done better than them in the playoffs those couple of years when they made the conference final. Leafs, of course, we all know where they stand, still looking for that playoff series victory first since 2004. So, yeah, when I look at Tavares, I still look at the big picture. And from an Islander standpoint, and kind of what the Leafs are hoping for more of, I mean, Tavares has had a great season. He's only a couple points off a point per game. But when you look big picture, 5 of his top 6 seasons at the NHL level in points per game were with the New York Islanders. So there was that 1 year where he had 88 points. Other than that, he's been below a point per game. So that's maybe, with so much money being devoted to a player like that, he's a great player. Of course, the 1 year he got injured in the playoffs, it's like, that's always like, what if he was playing? Maybe they wouldn't have lost to Montreal. Maybe they would have made the Cup final that year when Montreal made it. But you have to look at the here and now and moving forward. They're going to need a lot from Tavares in the playoffs to put them over the top. I think they're capable of that, but it's just it's one of those things we're all just still waiting to see it happen.
So I should preface by saying, and again, we do the NHL Fantasy on Ice podcast together, that we both have hot takes on every podcast, including the preseason. Your big hot take last summer was the fact that you thought the Leafs were going to miss the Stanley Cup playoffs, which I think was fair. There was a lot of question marks, at least for me, when it came to their goaltending situation. I think Sheldon Keefe has done a phenomenal job with this team. The goaltending's been better than expected. How has your sort of mindset changed with this Leafs team? And to that point, do you think they have a legitimate shot at doing anything substantial in the Stanley Cup playoffs, especially if they have to play Tampa again in the first round?
I mean, the biggest concerns I had were in the crease, and Matt Murray has
Yeah.
had a bunch of games this year where he stood on his head. I mean, that's what they need. Matt Murray has the playoff pedigree. Ilya Samsonov, his playoff career has been pretty limited because of different injuries and stuff like that in multiple seasons. But if these guys are healthy, they can work off of each other. I think that it was important for the Leafs to not fire Sheldon Keefe early in the season when they had that bad California road trip. They were patient, and let's give them another crack at this thing. I mean, the Leafs have really turned it around and proven that they're an elite regular season team once again. So I'm a little concerned about their road play this season and some of their road losses. A lot of their most suspect losses this season have come to bad lottery teams on the road, right? They lost at Montreal twice, at Detroit, swept by the Coyotes, lost in overtime at the Sharks and the Ducks. I mean, those are almost a checklist of the worst teams in the NHL, other than maybe Chicago and Philly, right, and Columbus. So that's a little bit of concern, but overall, I mean, I was wrong about the Leafs. You always try to look beyond the hype of different teams and try to identify flaws. I do still think, there are some flaws in this roster. And another big concern for me is like Morgan Riley is not producing up to his career track record or anything close to that. I know that an injury is involved, but these are things to keep in mind. Like the health of Murray and Samsonov and Morgan Riley are paramount because I don't think they can go far in the playoffs without two of those three guys being fully healthy.
You're bang on, and again, it makes no sense how you can get up for games against Boston and Tampa, and then really shit the bed. Pardon, better when it comes to teams like Montreal, like who had an AHL roster. Arizona, you lose twice to, and I think
Yeah,
that's the concerning part is that you see moments like that, and you're like, oh no, how many times have we seen that in the Stanley Cup playoffs? I watched it in living color against Montreal. I watched it against fucking Columbus. Like, I mean, it was just scary, you know the PTSD watching some of these games and then watching it come to fruition live on TV again on Saturday. But I think a lot of people were right in saying I was overreacting. I had to vent earlier on, and I did. From a DFS standpoint, and again, you have an expertise, a knowledgeable expertise in daily fantasy and betting. The Maple Leafs. Obviously, there's a couple names we talked about a lot the last couple months, Pete. Michael Bunting, Kelly Yarncroke. I think there's the expectation Toronto could try to adjust that line with Marner and Tavares a bit more, add somebody more bona fide. But there's some value, I think, in some of the depth pieces on the Leafs right now, right?
absolutely. I think that with their, some of their depth players, secondary guys, Connor Timmins comes to mind as a guy that's just been so productive on a per game basis. 12 points in 18 games, 3 on the power play. I've been looking at a couple of those different defensemen earlier in the year. It was Sandin, right, heated up when Riley was out. Now he's tapered off. It's been Timmins, Liljegren prior to the injury and stuff like that. So, yeah, I think that's one selling point about the Leafs this year. If those guys stay healthy, they do, and they still have Giordano. I know he's picked it up offensively of late. It seems like the Leafs have maybe more depth in the skater group offensively than they have in some of their playoff failures of the past. So that's a good thing, right? For trying to change the script and have a different result at the end of the day. So, yeah, that's some of the things I've been looking at, especially Timmins. And yeah, Calle Yarncroke's been inconsistent, but when he's in the top
Yeah.
six, he could do some damage on any given night.
Is there any futures value, in your opinion, on some awards for the Maple Leafs? Obviously, Austin Matthews. It's going to be tough to catch Connor McDavid what he's putting together with the Rocket. I think there's obviously a bit of value in Mitch Marner for the Hart Trophy. That's going to be a tough stretch. Is there anything you're looking at that could be some potential value with the Maple Leafs, or just some guys are foregone conclusions already for awards?
Yeah, I have a tough time seeing them land any of those awards. As far as Mitch Marner, I was just looking up some stats on him, and
Yeah,
he has at least a point in 41 of his 47 games. In terms of most games with at least a point in the NHL, it's a short list ahead of him. It's just Connor McDavid, and it's only slightly ahead of him. McDavid 43 in 48 games, Marner 41 in 47 games. So in terms of consistency, few have been better than Mitch Marner. I just on a team with Tavares and Matthews, and Nylander has had a great season as well. I just feel like the narratives around the Maple Leafs are just get it done in the playoffs and then the awards market that they could be involved in. Any of those guys I mentioned is the Conn Smythe if they ultimately hoist the trophy. But to answer your question, I don't see much appeal in terms of betting them to win any individual awards. Maybe Matt Murray comeback player of the year, but that's not on the odds board usually.
Yeah, the old Masterton, we love that award. But yeah, like I'm always careful, Pete, to tread when it comes to the Leafs and saying, "Oh, this is a different team," because I go and say that, and then they do that against Montreal. Like Rem Pitlick, really,
Right.
Raphael Harvey Pinard was skating circles against Austin Matthews, and I understand it's a game in mid January, but I don't know how you can't get up. And I know Samuel Montembeault, who we talked about in the fantasy podcast today, was really good in that game, but. To that point, I just don't see teams like Boston. They took care of San Jose on Sunday. Like teams like that who are legitimate contenders in my world never seem to blip the way the Leafs do because they can't get out of their own way. Like when they lose embarrassingly, and we saw it again against Montreal. To wrap, we've been laughing here on the show, and my co-host Jay Rosehill isn't here today, as you know. But we've been laughing for like a month. We know who the Leafs are playing in the first round. It's going to be a rematch with the Tampa Bay Lightning. I would put probably 99% it happens. What's your read on a potential rematch here? I know the Leafs had them on the ropes last year, but everybody always seems to have Tampa on the ropes. And Vasilevsky's like, no, I'm Mariano Rivera. Here's my cutter. Try and hit it. You're not hitting it. So what would your read be right now, assuming healthy rosters and all that stuff between Tampa and Toronto?
I mean, it would be another very tight series. I think that Toronto would have the edge in the depth, which could help them break through if they get to game 6 or 7 again and get a lead and they need that clinching goal. That was the problem last year. They just couldn't find it in the big spots. I think they have guys on their third defense pair, on their third line at even strength in the forward group that could help them finish the job this season if they play Tampa again. Tampa, of course, doesn't have nearly as much depth. Hagel's been a great story for them, but he's a product of Kucherov and Point on the top line. It's not like he's doing that damage on the third line. So that's my concern with Tampa. But of course, the bread and butter for them, like they've had a great season from Sergachev. They have Victor
Yep.
Hedman. The Leafs don't have one defenseman, including Riley when he's healthy, that matches up to either of those two guys, in my opinion. And then even with the surprise story of the Leafs goaltending, Vasilevsky stands far superior to either of those guys, even on their best days. So I would lean again with a very tight matchup, 6 or 7 games if they play each other, and I would lead with the Tampa Bay Lightning. But the Leafs do have the depth to be able to combat them a little bit more than they did last year.
Yeah, not to mention the competition we think will formulate over the next little while leading into March 3rd. You'd have to think Tampa, Toronto will be involved in the same type of players. And I just wonder who Tampa is going to fleece this time around. Last year was Hagel and Nick Paul. And we all know the incredible pipeline of Julien Brisebois. The last couple of years, Pete, this has been a lot of fun. Again, a reminder all to check out the NHL Fantasy on Ice podcast, subscribe, like, leave us a review. Just show us some love, right, Pete?
Yeah, definitely. We always have good times on that show. A lot of great guests that cover fantasy, season long, DFS, betting, and general puck talk, right? Like today, we talked so
Yeah.
much about the Vancouver Canucks coaching change, which players will benefit, what's the long term trajectory, what should they do in the offseason. We get to all of that. So if you're looking for something to cover all 32 teams, their prospects, their lineups across the board to complement your great Leafs show for the hometown team, definitely look no further than Fantasy on Ice. But thanks for having me on, buddy.
No worries. The number one fantasy hockey podcast on the planet. That is Pete Jensen. Thanks so much, Pete.
Thanks.